Good evening, everyone. I'm Sherilyn Eiffel. I'm the Vernon E. Jordan Jr. Distinguished Professor of Civil Rights at Howard Law School and the founding director of the 14th Amendment Center for Law and Democracy. And I welcome you to the second night of our launched series on the 14th Amendment. We're beginning with Birthright Citizenship. Last night, we had a wonderful session with historians Kate Masur and Martha Jones. It was jam-packed full of information, maybe too much information, but hopefully at the end of these sessions next week, when you get a listing of some of the cases, materials, and our book recommendations, you'll have a chance to do some study on your own. Today, we're going to continue the conversation on birthright citizenship, but in some ways go deeper. We'll be looking at how the experience of Asian Americans in the United States have shaped our understanding of the birthright citizenship provision in the 14th Amendment. I want to begin very briefly with a little overview of the 14th Amendment. And when I tell you I teach a whole semester on the 14th Amendment and it's not enough, understand that what I'm giving you is just a taste, just to set the stage for how we're going to have this conversation. The reason we're doing this is because of the significance of the 14th Amendment in American life, in American legal structure, and in our constitutional infrastructure. What troubles me is that most Americans know very little about the 14th Amendment. But the 14th Amendment has been called by historian Eric Foner the foremost living scholar of the Reconstruction period as the most important addition to the Constitution after the Bill of Rights, and that it is. It constitutes in its provisions the reset of American democracy, or what we call the second founding. If I ask you about the founding of our country, you'll talk about Hamilton and Washington and Jefferson. But how many people know that our country was refounded after the Civil War? And after the Civil War, 3 constitutional amendments constituted the framework of that refounding. The focus of those amendments was how we would deal with the issue of Black people who had been enslaved prior to the Civil War. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed slavery. The 15th Amendment says that you cannot deny people the right to vote based on race or color. But the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, contained the core guarantees that we've come to consider as part of the second founding of our country. And they're so ubiquitous, we are so comfortable with the concepts of the 14th Amendment that most Americans don't even know where they come from. They don't know who the framers of the 14th Amendment were. They don't know that it was mostly written by John Bingham. They don't know about Thaddeus Stevens. They don't know about Charles Sumner. They forget that people like Frederick Douglass was a founder of the 14th Amendment. Now, the amendment itself is the longest amendment in the Constitution. And you see it on the screen now. It's got 5 provisions. You're seeing the first 2. There are another 3. And even those of us who are lawyers and law students most often do not learn about the whole 14th Amendment. When I was in law school, I learned about Section 1, which is the most important, and Section 5, which we'll come to in subsequent webinar series. But tonight we're going to focus on Section 1, and we're going to go even deeper into just the first sentence of Section 1. To give you a sense of how rich the 14th Amendment is, we're spending tonight talking about a sentence. That's 2 nights we're spending talking about one sentence. But the 14th Amendment contains other guarantees that we'll talk about in subsequent webinars. One of them that you know about, even if you don't know where it comes from, is the guarantee of equality, of equal protection of laws. The concept of equality appears for the first time in our Constitution in the 14th Amendment. It does not appear in the original Constitution. You know that the original Constitution included a number of compromises about race, like the 3/5 Compromise, which determined that for purposes of congressional representation, states that had enslaved populations in the South would be able to count the enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person, not a whole person. That's known as the 3/5 Compromise. And the first Constitution even sanctioned the continuation of the slave trade until 1808. So there was no provision of equality in the Constitution that we have come to revere and see Broadway shows about and movies about. But the second Constitution, the one that begins with the 3 amendments I just described, those 3 amendments open up this new national identity as a place where equality is a core value. What is also critical, of course, is defining citizenship. As I said, a key issue was how to deal with the formerly enslaved population who now needed to be integrated into the body politic in America. The first thing that was critical and most important after ensuring that slavery was abolished was ensuring that Black people would be citizens, that we would not be stateless people. And to do that required a constitutional provision. Actually, the framers had first included a citizenship provision in a civil rights statute, the first ever civil rights statute passed in this country, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, passed 2 years before the 14th Amendment. But President Johnson, who succeeded President Lincoln, he had been Lincoln's vice president. He was a Southerner. He did not believe in secession, but he was a white supremacist. And he vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And so the framers, the members of Congress, many of whom were former abolitionists, the people we call the radical Republicans, felt that they had to ensure that to protect Black citizenship, it was done in a constitutional amendment, which cannot be overturned by mere statute, by a subsequent Congress, or by presidential fiat. And so the first provision of the 14th Amendment was designed to focus on citizenship. They had to deal with something else. In 1857, the Supreme Court had decided a case which many of you have heard of, the Dred Scott decision. And in the Dred Scott decision, the United States Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney of Maryland, decided that Black people in this country not only were not citizens, but could never be citizens. This meant that not only were formerly enslaved Black people not citizens, but free Black people, of which there were many living primarily in the North, had now become stateless persons. The language of the 14th Amendment, that first sentence, which is the birthright citizenship provision, overturns the Dred Scott decision. And the language is there. All persons born in the United States or naturalized and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. That sentence is doing a lot, and we don't even have time to fully unpack it. But suffice it to say, born citizenship, naturalized citizenship makes you a citizen both of the nation and of the state in which you reside. This is important because the Dred Scott case involved a question of whether Black people could be citizens of a state. In the 14th Amendment, the Congress is telling states that if someone resides in your state, born in the United States, they are a citizen of their nation and of the state. You'll see that language, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and that becomes very important in the context of birthright citizenship, and we'll come to that in a moment. So that's the language of birthright citizenship. You're born on this soil or you are naturalized. You are a citizen both of the nation and of the state in which you reside. Let's keep going. So this question of, that's Chief Justice Roger Taney, who wrote the infamous Dred Scott decision. Many people have called it the opening salvo of the Civil War, making it clear that the only way to resolve the question of slavery was going to be either by violence or by constitutional amendment. But let's go on. In 1898, the question was raised, what does subject to the jurisdiction thereof mean? And the United States at the time was attempting to take the position that subject to the jurisdiction thereof means that children who are born in the United States to parents who are not citizens are not themselves citizens, that they are subject to a foreign power. The legislative history, of course, tells a different story. Subject to the jurisdiction thereof was meant to apply to children of diplomats. Diplomats are subject, of course, to their country. That's why we have diplomatic immunity. Children who are born to prisoners of war on this soil would be not subject to US jurisdiction. And of course, there's a whole tradition and set of cases that address the status of Native Americans who assert their tribal citizenship before their US citizenship. But subject to the jurisdiction thereof never meant what the United States tried to say it meant in that case. And that case is United States versus Wong Kim Ark. You're seeing an image of Wong Kim Ark, who was the child of Chinese parents who were not citizens, but he was born on this soil. And the United States Supreme Court in 1898 said he is a citizen because he was born on this soil. And that has been the understanding of birthright citizenship ever since 1898. As many of you know, earlier this year, however, President Trump issued an executive order in which he purports to carve out an exception to birthright citizenship to children who were born without at least one parent being a permanent resident or being a citizen. Now, the first thing you should understand is, just as a matter of constitutional structure, an executive order cannot overturn a constitutional amendment. The only way to overturn a constitutional amendment is by a new constitutional amendment, which overturns a prior one, or the Supreme Court offering a different interpretation of that constitutional provision. And that's what the Trump administration is going for with their executive order. So with that being said, we're going to launch into tonight's conversation. We are joined by three exceptional scholars and advocates who are with us tonight. They filed an excellent brief in one of the cases challenging Trump's executive order, Washington versus Trump. A link to that brief will be in the chat, and I strongly suggest that you download it and read it. It is superb. But I first want to introduce and make sure we know who is in the room. So we have Robert Sung-Chi Chang. He is professor of law and Sylvia Mendez Presidential Chair for Civil Rights and Executive Director of the UC Irvine School of Law, Fred Korematsu Center for Law and Equality. I've known him for a number of years. He's a prolific scholar. His books and articles are amazing, and I'm so thrilled that he could join us tonight. We're also joined by Jessica Levin, and now I'm going to get my glasses because I'm trying to pretend in my vanity that I can see, who's the assistant teaching professor of law at Seattle University School of Law, and she's director of the Center for Civil Rights and Critical Justice. She also teaches the Civil Rights Clinic at Seattle. And then Bethany Lee is the newly minted executive director of the Asian American Legal Defense Fund, a great civil rights organization, which often partners with the organization I was privileged to lead, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So welcome to all three of you. I'm so thrilled that you could be with us. Now, I've asked Bob Chang, if he would begin by just kind of offering something of a brief survey and overview of some of the laws governing citizenship and naturalization. What I hope in this conversation you will be able to see is how the experience of Asian Americans in this country has refined and helped us understand this question of birthright citizenship, but it also shows the kind of struggles, the kind of challenges that have been in this field, so that we understand the moment that we're facing today is not new. We have seen all of these arguments before. We have seen these challenges before. And this particular history that we're going to explore tonight is going to be critical to understanding how we confront the challenges as the cases that have been filed challenging the executive order move through the system and end up back in the Supreme Court perhaps later this year. So I want to begin with Professor Chang.
Thank you, Sherilyn, for inviting me to this very important conversation. And thank you for setting the table so well in terms of the background. So I want to talk a little bit about how the US Constitution doesn't define citizenship. And it doesn't say anything about naturalization, how one becomes a citizen if you are not already a citizen, other than saying that Congress is to pass a uniform act of naturalization. And so in 1790, Congress does that. And the Uniform Act of Naturalization says that free white persons can become naturalized. And you can see then who is included and who is not included. And so then following that, we saw, Professor Eiffel described Dred Scott versus Taney and the effect that had, that Black Americans could never become citizens, regardless of how many generations they might have been free in the United States. And it did take the 14th Amendment and that one sentence that does so much work. But what about other groups? What about people of Asian ancestry? Well, Congress in 1882, when it passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, included in the Chinese Exclusion Act a provision that specifically said that persons of Chinese ancestry could not become naturalized. Now, what's interesting about this is we might wonder, well, why did they have to do that? Because, and I'm sorry, I'm going a little out of order, but in 1870, Congress revised the 1790 Naturalization Act to say that white persons and persons of African nativity and descent could become naturalized. So two groups are specified. Other groups are not. What about people of Asian ancestry? We might think that you don't need a separate statute to exclude people of Chinese ancestry from naturalization, but they went ahead, and maybe it's a belt and suspenders approach. So in 1882, they said Chinese people cannot become naturalized. Now, Professor Eiffel talked about how Wong Kim Ark's parents were of Chinese ancestry and immigrants, but they weren't US citizens. Well, part of why they weren't US citizens included that they could not become US citizens, even if they had wanted to. We don't know. I don't think the historical record tells us anything about whether the parents wanted to become naturalized, but they were forbidden from doing so. And they also ended up leaving the country. And who knows, if they had been able to become part of the fabric of this country by becoming full members, well, maybe they would have become citizens. And then, we would have had two pathways for Wong Kim Ark to have become recognized.
Professor Chang, I'm going to stop you right there because that's like chock full, and I want to make sure everybody is understanding the steps. First of all, I want to go back to the beginning when I was talking about the 14th Amendment and make clear that the framers of the 14th Amendment talked about whether children of non-citizen Chinese people would be included in the provision of birthright citizenship. And I don't know if Jennifer is able to put that section up of the debates, but there were debates within the legislature among the representatives in which some representatives were saying, are you saying by this language that would provide birthright citizenship in this amendment that we're arguing about, are you saying that the children of Chinese immigrants who are born here would be citizens? And the retort in several conversations is yes. Yes, even if the parents are not citizens, if the child is born on this soil, yes, that child is a citizen. Now, I regard this as critically important because we have a court that likes to talk about originalism and likes to talk about the original intent of the framers. And I want to be clear, and it's important for two reasons. One, because the framers of the 14th Amendment had already anticipated arguments that might be made against disfavored immigrant groups, just as arguments are being made now about Latino groups. At the time then, it was about the Chinese. So they had already anticipated that and answered the question conclusively that yes, the children born here would be subject to birthright citizenship. The second reason that I think it's important is that those framers had their own, are demonstrating how they anticipated the kinds of fractures that we seem to think are unique to this moment. They understood and they were grappling too with what it will mean to create a multiracial democracy. Sometimes we get blowback because we have people like the president saying, you know, birthright citizenship was only meant to cover the children of enslaved people, which is absolutely not true, because obviously it was meant to cover free Black people as well, but it was also understood that it would cover any child who was born here, even the children of non-citizen immigrant parents. And then we get to, Bob, your point about the continuing prejudice that exists against the Chinese and the enactment of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which forbids Chinese from becoming naturalized citizens. And if we had more time, I would get into, you know, Frederick Douglass and his opposition to the Chinese Exclusion Act and so forth. But I just want to make sure that people understand that progression, that it is this enduring prejudice that leads to the Chinese Exclusion Act, even though the provision of birthright citizenship would cover any Chinese child that was a Chinese American child that was born here in this country. So, Bob, let me take it back to you for about 3 more minutes, and then we'll keep going.
So that's exactly right. And I'm so glad you raised that in terms of the uncontroverted meaning of the 14th Amendment as established by their conversations. What I worry, though, of course, is that even though there is this sort of notion of originalism, we also do find that there are some different views about textualism that are coming in. And so as soon as there is the evidence that the framers of the second founding had a different meaning, what we're going to see is the whack-a-mole, you know, the argument shift,
Sure.
and it's textualism. Like, we know, we can decide what those words mean. And so, you know, I think it's so great. And yesterday you had such a fantastic conversation that really did establish the original meaning of the 14th Amendment. That is exactly right. Now, what's interesting then is that works for birthright, but naturalization takes another pathway. And many people may not be familiar with the story of the ways that naturalization was forbidden to people of Asian ancestry. So you had first the Chinese, who were specifically by statute not excluded, and also not affirmatively permitted under the 1870 statute. And I know later on that Bethany is going to talk about 2 very important cases in 1922 and 1923. So I don't want to go into that, but I will sort of go fast forward and talk a little bit about how this became undone, because many people are not familiar with, well, what did it take for the door to naturalization to open up for Asian immigrants? The first group that was allowed to naturalize were the Chinese, and this took place in 1943. And the only reason for this was for political reasons, because China was an ally of the United States during World War II. Following the end of the war, Filipinos and South Asians were permitted in 1946. And finally, the racial bar to naturalization did not end until 1952. And so what we find is, because in some ways, there's this notion that this is a decision made by the political branches in a way where the courts are not supposed to have a say, we've allowed the political branches to engage in naked racism. And the court's role in this is to say, well, you know, this is for the political branches. We can't decide something like this. And I think that's one of the real tragedies. And I'm so glad that I'm able to speak a little bit on this.
Thank you so much, Bob. I'd love to talk about 2 cases that are among the most fascinating, and I think, Bethany, you're going to talk about them: Ozawa versus the United States and Thind versus the United States. These 2 cases are really important because, you know, America is such an interesting place. There are always these efforts to try and become full and free citizens. And in some ways, these efforts are efforts to become white, because that is the only way to exercise full and free citizenship in this country. And so I wondered if you could begin, Bethany, by talking about United States versus Thind. And there's going to be a link to the case in the chat. We won't leave this picture up, but that's a picture of Mr. Thind. He had been a veteran of World War I for the United States. He had fought in the Army of the United States during World War I. And then if we can just go to Bethany and have you talk about this case and the Ozawa case. I'm not sure in which order you want to talk about them.
Yeah, I mean, so I think thank you so much. And I want to say first, I think these cases are very much about the idea of inclusion versus exclusion, right? Those are words that Bob used earlier. And these cases, no matter how you thread it, right, when you're talking about what legal arguments they are using, it's actually based on these white supremacist ideologies about who belongs and doesn't belong in this country. And whether it's talking about stripping citizenship, naturalization, who gets to naturalize, who is denaturalized, or just the straight deportations of people in our different communities, I think these are kind of the broader concepts that we should be thinking about when considering these two cases, Ozawa and Thind, in the context of exclusion, right? And so I'm going to start with Ozawa first, because I think in both of these cases, you're right, that people are trying to, in some sense, define themselves as white, because that is what it would mean to be eligible for citizenship in the United States. And so in Ozawa v. United States, the Supreme Court actually interpreted the term white person to mean Caucasian. And as a result, because Ozawa as a Japanese person was not Caucasian, despite the fact that he had been in the United States for decades, was ineligible for citizenship. So then we turn to Thind. There, they said, well, and this is partially why I'm saying, in some sense, the legal arguments don't really matter, right? They're saying, well, you might be Caucasian, but you're not white. There, we had exactly as you said, a veteran of World War I who was characterized as a high caste Hindu of full Indian blood. And he was arguing, based in part on the reasoning from Ozawa, that he's Caucasian and therefore eligible for citizenship. The court instead disagreed and said that basically they said, you know a white person when you see a white person, and this person is not a white person. That was essentially the message from the court. And as a result, his citizenship was revoked. And so after Thind, though, this is actually, I think, particularly important for this moment, that campaign to exclude didn't stop. And I think we're seeing this in this particular, in the whole birthright citizenship case, in this campaign to actually strip people of citizenship, right? Because what happened after that, they didn't stop with Thind. They actually, and interestingly, they even went after his lawyer, right? They went after more than 50 people who were Indian to try to denaturalize them. And so they stripped people of their citizenship retroactively. These are all people who had been here for years, sometimes for decades. They ran small businesses, they owned property, they had US citizen children, they were married. I think I say all these, I include all these details because I think this actually should sound familiar to the demographic of people that we are trying to exclude now, right? And to me, there's at least a couple of takeaways from this history. I think what's not talked about enough is the mental health toll of what it means to be stripping someone of citizenship, right? One of the South Asian men who was stripped of citizenship killed himself because it essentially stripped his sense of being. Not just, and why did it strip his sense of being? Because it stripped so many rights in terms of what he was entitled to, the land, the ability to travel, freedom of movement, ability to work, right? I think we actually don't think about enough and don't emphasize that enough when we think about deportations. And
yeah, so let's slow that down. Let's slow that down for a second, Bethany. And all of this is included in the excellent, superb amicus brief that you all filed in Washington versus Trump. But this struck me. So first of all, I have studied and taught the Thind case and had no idea that the United States government had set about stripping citizenship of other Indians following the case, including his lawyer. Had no idea. People who had been here for a long time, who had successful businesses, and so on and so forth. The second piece that was so interesting to me is what you just said, is that we should remember the things that accompany citizenship, and the rights that are afforded an individual as a citizen. And in the brief, you talk about what you just described, that one of the individuals, maybe it was the man who committed suicide, no longer could own land because there were laws in that state against people who were foreign nationals owning land in that state. So he had to give over his business that he owned. And we should really think about that. There are a number of states, I think Texas has just passed a law that Chinese nationals cannot purchase property. That we should be thinking about the collateral consequences that are associated with the removal of citizenship, which is its own thing. But I just wanted to make sure that people understood exactly what you were saying about like the way it affected the lives of these people. And I wondered if you wouldn't also just say something about the potential for statelessness, which I think is huge.
Yeah, I mean,
First of all, what do I even mean by statelessness? I think it's a term we all bandy about, but I think most people haven't heard because most people never have to confront the possibility of it.
statelessness is actually, I think, is the result of discrimination actually based on race, which is not actually what we even talk about when we talk about the stripping of citizenship, right? And so what happens is because citizenship is stripped, this person belongs to no country. And the rights that you are all just mentioning, including the right to travel, the right to work, the right to own property, all of these different rights that are associated with sometimes citizenship, sometimes not, right?
Mm-hmm. Bethany, you're frozen.
Statelessness.
Bethany, there you go. You were frozen for a second.
Oh, sorry.
No. You're fine.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. And we don't think about this often, but I think it actually can be illustrated in the context of undocumented immigrants in the United States. Being stateless and being undocumented is not the same, but in terms of the rights available to you, sometimes it can be very similar. And so in our brief, we actually detail some of the differences for undocumented siblings versus their siblings who are US citizens. And there you really see the stark contrast of what people actually have access to, right? And so one of the examples is this woman, Teresa, who was actually the inspiration behind the DREAM Act. And you can see the mental health toll on her versus her brother, who's in some sense told by his parents, you have ample opportunity to
He's
thrive.
born here. He's born in the US.
Yeah, he's it's our US citizen younger brother. So in some sense, because he's told you have ample opportunity to thrive and you have access to all of these different rights, there's a mental health toll that you see first in the, it's funny, she kind of jokes that you think of dreamers as people who are straight A students, and she was not a straight A student. She thinks she got straight C's, versus her brother, maybe because of the pressures and because of the possibilities, was able to get A's. And then the difference is also with some of the other stories of undocumented immigrants and their siblings, where Ruthie, for example, in our brief, she was only able to get access to community college, and it would have taken her years to graduate because she was also working overtime at takeout restaurants in order to support her family. Whereas her brother and her US citizen brothers and sisters, again, were able to access education, have been able to
eligible for financial aid and
eligible for financial aid, all of that stuff, right? That undocumented people don't have access to. So again, statelessness and then being undocumented are different, but when you're
The
talking,
consequences. Mhm.
yeah, you see many of the same rights being stripped or not
So
available.
we're going to come back to this when we talk about um, the current litigation that is percolating right now. But I want to make sure that we fully flush out this historical piece that we were talking about. So we've got the clear discussion among the framers of the 14th Amendment that children who are born here, even to non-citizen parents, are uh, entitled and covered by birthright citizenship. We have, however, the enduring racism, anti-Chinese racism that appears in these anti-naturalization statutes, which really don't leave us until 1952. And we have in the early 20th century these struggles, these efforts by individual Asian Americans to assert their American citizenship by bringing various challenges like Osawa and Thind. But we also have some other statutes, and particularly statutes that affect the status, the citizenship status of women. And I wanted Jessica to talk about I think it's the Expatriate Act of 1907, and then also the Cable Act, which I think is also known as the Married Women's Act. And I think this is really important because, again, as we think about the birthright citizenship language and regime, the desire was to create one system. This is why this is part of the second founding. Remember, we're a country that at the Civil War fractures into two, all around the issue of race and slavery. And what the framers of the 14th Amendment are doing is they are asserting the primacy of our national government. That's why the language says you're a citizen of the United States and of the state in which you reside. Your national citizenship is the most important. And they're trying to create one system. The enduring desire of those framers is to ensure that we have no caste system in this country. So they want one system. But the pushback keeps happening in Congresses that are excluding Chinese Americans from naturalization or passing acts that have a particular kind of effect on women who marry foreign nationals. And so, Jessica, I was hoping you could share some of that history with us.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you again, Professor Eiffel, for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. It's wonderful to be in the company of my fellow colleagues and advocates who filed this brief together. So the important thing to remember, I think, and to sort of appropriately put some frame around what I'm about to discuss is that we just heard from Bethany about the denaturalization cases that resulted after the Thind decision that affected, I think, as far as we know, about 50 people. These weren't an aberration. They were instead another chapter in the government's history of revoking citizenship of women and people of color. And so in our brief, we really wanted to focus not only on the example of the government's attempts to denaturalize naturalized citizens, but also to strip citizenship of birthright citizens. And that's where the Expatriation Act of 1907 comes in. Before I give a bit of detail.
So just again, to slow you down,
yes.
Because what you just said is really important.
So important.
Right? That
yes.
What you're about to talk about is the use of statutes to restrict the citizenship of birthright citizens who were born in the United States. And this is not legislation targeted at Asian Americans.
No.
And the effect of it falls mostly on women. So with that set up, keep going.
Yes, no, and I very much appreciate that framing, and that's exactly right. What we're going to do by talking about the Expatriation Act of 1907, as well as the Cable Act of 1922, is see that although the face of the law was targeted at women, the impact of the law was extreme on Asian American women specifically, and we'll sort of explain why that is. Before I launch into just a few minutes to sort of explain how this worked, I do want to recognize the work of Letty Volk, of Felice Batlin, and Candace Lewis Redbender that we relied on in researching and writing this section of the brief. We're always standing on someone's shoulders, and so I thought it important to name those historians and scholars whose work we really benefited from. So in the Expatriation Act of 1907, Congress decided to strip U.S. citizen-born women of their citizenship if they married foreign nationals. This was in response to the State Department's concerns that the sort of country needed more uniform rules around who was going to be entitled to a US passport and who would be entitled to consular protection abroad. It was also a reflection of a more generalized fear around the instability caused by imperialism at the turn of the century. So the Expatriation Act was on its face targeted at women and reflected very, very gendered notions of dependency. It presumed that a woman's allegiance belonged to her husband, not her country. So of course, if she married a foreigner, she could not be expected to maintain allegiance to her country. So to guard against this perceived, conflict of interest, if you will, Section 3 of the Expatriation Act provided that, quote, any American woman who marries a foreigner shall take the nationality of her husband. And the historical record, I want to add here, even though it's not, again, explicit on the face of the act, it shows that the act was actually in practice applied retroactively. So while
say that again.
Yeah, so the face of the Expatriation Act did not apply retroactively, but the historical record shows that the government, again, in practice, applied it retroactively. So this is not
hold
something.
On. Let's just make sure everybody's keeping track, because we're going to get to talking about what we may be confronting in the current period. Keep track of all the things we're identifying: denaturalization, stripping of citizenship, stripping of birthright citizenship, on marriage. All of these things we should be just keeping track of as we go through this conversation.
Absolutely. And perhaps at the end, we can circle back to the threat of retroactivity of the citizenship stripping executive order. So yes, we should put a pin in that.
Because remember, the current executive order, when it goes into effect, if it is allowed to go into effect, begins 30 days from the date that it's allowed to go into effect and looks to the future. So it should not implicate anyone who was born before 30 days before this EO was issued. But it's important because you're describing a circumstance in which the application ended up being retroactive no matter what the statute said.
Exactly.
And we should bear that in mind at this moment. Okay, go ahead.
Exactly. So what both Professor Eiffel referred to, and as I referred to just in my opening observation about the impact of the Expatriation Act, is that, of course, on its face, it targeted women, but it had a radically different impact on Asian American women specifically. So again, while not explicit in the text of the act, US citizen women could only resume their citizenship after their marriage ended if they were racially eligible to naturalize. And as we just heard from Professor Chang, Asian persons of Asian descent, Asian Americans, as I like to say, were racially ineligible to naturalize. And so once that birthright citizen lost her citizenship, there was no way to regain it due to that racist
let's
way.
walk this through. So you're a woman who is born here. You're what we would call today a Chinese American woman. Let's say that your ancestry is Chinese American. You're born here in this country. You marry someone from another country. The Expatriation Act means you have lost your citizenship, even though you were a birthright citizen, to the citizenship of your husband. The marriage ends, you get divorced, and now you want to continue being a citizen in the country where you were born and where you perhaps have lived your whole life. But now, because of the laws that Bob was describing, because you are not an American citizen, because it's been stripped, and of Chinese ancestry, you cannot become a naturalized citizen.
That's exactly right. Yes. And, in the brief, we told a story of an individual that had exactly this thing happen to her. This woman's name was Ing Feng Sing. She was born in Port Ludlow, which is not too far from where I sit right now in Washington, in the state of Washington. She was born in 1898, the same year as the Wong Kim Ark decision, to Chinese parents. So she was a birthright citizen. And when she was 5, her parents took her to live in China, where she married a Chinese citizen. When her husband died in 1925, she came back to the US and was denied entry. So the Expatriation Act had functioned to strip her of her citizenship, and the Chinese exclusion laws in place at the time of her return meant that she was, again, potentially stateless and, of course, ineligible to naturalize. So we thought it very, very important, just like in the brief, we told the story of Mr. Thind himself to really highlight the individualized stories of people whose lives were drastically altered by these laws.
That is fascinating history. Did you want to add one other thing before we go on?
Yeah, just to briefly say what happened with the Cable Act in 1922.
Oh, yeah, of course.
So Congress repealed parts of the Cable Act repealed parts of the Expatriation Act in 1922. And it stated that any woman citizen who marries an alien ineligible to citizenship shall cease to be a citizen of the United States. So to unpack that a little bit, whereas before, if any woman had married any foreign national, citizenship was stripped. So even though the Cable Act in 1922 repealed part of that, it still meant that if you were a US citizen woman and you married now sort of a smaller class of foreign nationals, i.e. those who were ineligible for naturalization, you would still have your citizenship stripped. So it was a partial solution, let's say, or partial repeal to the Expatriation Act of 1907. And so the bottom line was that any Asian American woman who lost her citizenship via marriage was, even after the marriage ended, exactly like the regime under the 1907 Act, was ineligible to pursue citizenship again.
When did this all end? Did the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act end all of this as well?
Mm-hmm. That's my understanding.
Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about something that is not law, but that I think is critically important that I noticed in your brief. Most of us have been talking about the executive order that was issued as the Birthright Citizenship Executive Order. And you all describe it as the Citizenship Stripping Order. Now, I'm really into comms because I think how we talk about things is really important, and narrative very much drives many of these issues. That was clearly a conscious choice to describe the EO in that way. Can you just say something about that decision? And also, is that in fact the way we should be talking about it, rather than as a birthright citizenship EO, which sounds like it's conferring something rather than taking something away?
I can speak to that very, very briefly, and I would welcome Professor Chang and Bethany's thoughts on this as well. I do want to give credit to the term. This is actually something that the Washington Attorney General's office in Washington versus Trump started at the onset of the litigation. When we decided to file an amicus, we saw that language choice and thought, that's what we need to adopt. Mm-hmm. This is the truth-telling moment of it. And so rather than sort of making it sound too clinical or not sort of engaging in truth-telling by just calling it a birthright executive order, let's name what it's doing. I think it underscores, again, the human impact that we have tried to describe in this conversation, and that undoubtedly will take place if the EO is allowed to go into effect. And I think it reflects a larger, advocacy strategy that we engage in when we do amicus work, which is to really look at the narrative that the parties are putting forth and say, what do we want to pull out and really underscore, or what do we need to add to the conversation to make sure that the right sort of narrative story is unfolding before the courts and to the extent, possible in the public.
I think that's really important. So law students and young lawyers who are listening, picking your language and you don't have to adopt the language that has been given to you. You can decide that you want to describe it a different way, and sometimes that's important to do. Bob, did you want to add anything on that front? I wanted to bring this back around to the current moment and to first of all talk about the posture of the cases. So we all know that President Trump issued an executive order. It was immediately challenged by 22 attorney generals of various states. Of 22 states, it was challenged by organizations that work on behalf of immigrants' rights and by individuals. Every single federal district court confronted with the case issued a nationwide injunction stopping the administration from being able to enforce the executive order on the grounds that the executive order is patently and on its face unconstitutional. The language is very strong from all of the federal district court judges that they have not seen something more patently on its face unconstitutional. So they lost. The federal government lost in the federal district court. They lost in appellate courts. They went to the United States Supreme Court, but they did not go up to the Supreme Court on the question of whether trying to carve out an exception from birthright citizenship or citizenship stripping is constitutional. Instead, what they brought to the Supreme Court was the question of whether a federal district court could stop the federal government from issuing and using and enforcing this EO on a nationwide level. In other words, can one single federal district court in a particular federal district enjoin the federal government from doing something across the nation? This has been an issue that has been a favorite of legal conservatives and conservative legal scholars, and has been an issue that has been teed up a number of times. Now, it was teed up when President Biden was president, but for some reason the Supreme Court was not interested in taking up that issue then, but they were very interested in taking it up in this case. And it's almost shocking because the posture of this case is actually a terrible vehicle for to strike down nationwide injunctions, because it makes sense that when you have a national policy that involves citizenship, that you don't want to have one policy in Washington state and another policy in Minnesota. But nevertheless, the Supreme Court took this issue up and indeed decided that federal district courts do not have the power to issue nationwide injunctions, and sent these cases, therefore, back to the federal district courts. A colloquy during oral argument was about whether or not the plaintiffs in these cases could use the vehicle of class actions to try and get orders that would affect people across the country. Class actions are a form of what we call aggregated litigation. It means you aggregate claims together, like claims together. You probably all have seen it, and maybe you've even been a member of a class action. You got a notice in the mail that said, you know, you're going to get money back because you're part of the class action of people who bought a pen from a store that had something in it that was wrong, or that got overcharged by $3 on, you know, a ticket to somewhere. Those are all class actions. And very often when we challenge policies as being violative of civil rights, we're bringing class actions as well. And so back to the district court these cases went, and very promptly the lawyers sought class certification. They were granted class certification in at least 2 of these cases. The classes are nationwide classes. There are people who would be born, who would be covered by this EO, and they received and the district courts established injunctions for the class. So it has the effect of a nationwide injunction, but not the kind of nationwide injunction that agitates, apparently, the conservatives. What does that mean? That means these cases will go forward. The United States is certainly challenging the issue of class certification and will challenge the issue of class certification, but we should expect that these cases will percolate and make their ways up to the United States Supreme Court again on the merits of whether or not citizenship stripping is constitutional. In the meantime, we've seen some of the very alarming cases around immigration that bear on this question. And I'm thinking about the Nome versus Vasquez-Perdomo case from 2 weeks ago, in which the Supreme Court on its shadow docket allowed to go forward the policy in Los Angeles that is being conducted by the Department of Homeland Security, that is executing raids on various workplaces, on Home Depot and various other places, to try and do a kind of dragnet of undocumented immigrants. That dragnet very often includes United States citizens. There is no question but that race is part of the motivation as they go about challenging the status of individuals. And last week, the Supreme Court essentially allowed, and some would say, given the singular opinion of Justice Kavanaugh, which no other justice joined, but gives us a window into what some of the conversations are, that racial profiling is okay as a part of kind of this immigration interdiction, and made light of the effect of this on actual citizens who may be subject to these raids. And I wondered if you all, it just seemed to trigger all the things that you were writing about in your brief, and to help us understand how all of these issues bear on one another, that we can describe and talk about citizenship as different than being undocumented, as you were saying, Bethany. But when we have a regime of racial profiling, the effect may be in the same. You may be in an ICE facility for weeks, or in some cases months, or in some cases years as a US citizen, right next to somebody who is undocumented, simply because you were swept up in a dragnet that was motivated by racial profiling. So I wondered if you all would respond just to what you're seeing right now and how it affects the very issues that you've been talking about that we saw historically. I'll start with you, Bob, and then go to Bethany.
So I had the misfortune of having to sit with the Supreme Court. I don't want to call it an opinion because it's the things on the shadow docket. I don't want to just honor it with that label. But I had to sit with it because a group of us were getting ready the next day to file an amicus brief in Newsom versus Trump. And that's the case involving the federalized National Guard in Los Angeles. These are all connected with each other. And so the Vasquez-Perdomo case is so disturbing because you're exactly right. Once it becomes once you allow these roving patrols to engage in racial profiling, anybody can get caught up. I mean, and it's frightening then what I've heard people talk about, including people who are citizens carrying around their birth certificates or passports with the hope that this will shield them from this. There was a man that was picked up who had a real ID, presented it to them, and to get a real ID, you need to have legal status. I mean, that's the point of the real ID. And they just took it. They didn't give it back to him, and it took a long time. Like, I'm trying to remember whether it was later that day or later, until they finally released him. And people may say, "Oh, but that's it was a brief encounter." And I wonder whether Justice Kavanaugh would cavalierly describe it as that. But if you think about the terror that it creates, the dignitary harm, I am so worried about where the court is going ultimately on the merits in Vasquez-Romero and racial profiling with regard to immigration enforcement, especially because people may not be aware that the jurisdiction of the DHS with regard to immigration, it's not on the borders. I mean, we've seen that. Historically, it had been 100 miles around any port of entry. And you take all the airports in this country that style themselves international airports, I'd imagine that maybe 90% of this country is subject to border policing because of the way that this works. We have a different set of rules that apply with regard to the border. We have a different set of rules that seem to apply with regard to who we allow to be part of our national community. And those are the things that I am most worried about. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Bob. Bethany, very quickly, and then I think we can get to at least one question.
I think we first say we live in a different world. And I think we understand this right now. We live in a different world from a year ago, when undocumented people are going to be swept up in the same way as citizens and put in the same prison cell, right? And how did we get there, I think, is part of the question for me. And if we look back at these historical cases, if we look back at the denaturalization of South Asians, I think we see some of that in terms of how we have, I think, fallen into a good, bad immigrant narrative that has now kind of swept up even citizens. What do I mean by that? In the denaturalization cases, the initial intention was to denaturalize so-called people with bad moral character. In some sense, we might even compare that to what the group of people we call criminals and terrorists.
The worst of the worst, right?
Exactly.
That's supposed to be the focus. Mm-hmm.
And those are the words that we're still using, right? We use words like criminals, aliens, terrorists, communists, right? Those are the words that we use. But then again, looking back at these denaturalization cases, what ended up happening was many people beyond the so-called bad moral character people got swept up in many of these cases, including Thin's lawyer himself, right? And so I think it's instructive for how we ended up in this situation where we're talking about birthright citizenship actually being stripped, right? And where we're talking about racial profiling actually being allowed by the Supreme Court. And
One of the questions that I saw we got from the floor was someone wondering whether Thin's lawyer had been able to vote before his citizenship was stripped. I don't know if anyone knows that.
I don't know, but I think it actually raises a really good point that I'd forgotten to say earlier in terms of the right to vote, right? When we're talking about rights.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're in this kind of moment in which everything feels like it's on the table, right? Almost all of the things that you have talked about from the history, right? Loom. No matter what the words say, of the EO. And so I think it's important because what I wanted people to understand tonight is that the stakes are incredibly high, that these are not new issues that we are confronting, that these are issues that we have been able to see the consequences of. We have an actual history to instruct us on what this would mean. So separate and apart from the fact that it violates the original intent of the 14th Amendment, separate and apart from the fact that it goes against the very effort and vision of the framers to ensure that we had one national system that governed who is a citizen and who is not a citizen, and that we had a very simple way of making that determination. Congress has the power under the Constitution to manage naturalization, and birthright citizenship ensures that you are a citizen of this country. And yet we're seeing over and over again, largely driven by racial prejudice, efforts to undermine that system that those framers thought and hoped would be an airtight system. And so as we confront these cases that are going to move forward in the coming weeks and months, what I wanted to ensure was that you, as you're reading the newspaper, and I know that sounds old school, let's say you're online reading whatever is your social media feed or wherever you get your news from, watching your TikToks, that you understand that there is a very clear historical basis for understanding this set of issues. This is not something new and innovative that is related to any particular kind of migration that is happening in this moment. This is all part of a long-standing pattern. And I also secondarily would want you to understand that this is not about those people. This is about all of us. That when you start tinkering with citizenship, you are encompassing everyone in this country who considers themselves and who is an American citizen and who believes that they hold the rights of a citizen. This metastasizes, as you're hearing in this conversation from our scholars tonight. And so I hope you'll take that to heart. I thank you all for joining us tonight. You are going to get a lot of information next week that's going to have links to all of the cases that we've talked about. Tonight in the chat was a link to the amicus brief that I suggest that you read. When we send out that mailing next week, you'll also get links from the first night's webinar from last night so that you'll have all of the information, and you'll have my book recommendations. If you want to learn more, not just about birthright citizenship, but about the 14th Amendment, books that you can read that will bring you up to speed, that are reader friendly, and you don't have to be a lawyer to understand them. But this is only the beginning. This is the first set of webinars from the 14th Amendment Center for Law and Democracy at Howard Law School. We're going to continue this throughout the year to give you, just ordinary Americans, an opportunity to learn about this powerful and important constitutional provision designed to protect those who are the least favored and among the most marginalized in our country. It's time we understand and speak in constitutional terms about our rights and about our protections. The next set of webinars will be on voting rights and the 14th Amendment, and it will be particularly important because on October 15th, the Supreme Court is hearing a case, Louisiana versus Calais, in which the question that the court has decided should be on the table is whether a key provision of the Voting Rights Act violates the 14th Amendment. So everything we're talking about is incredibly timely, incredibly important. I want to thank Robert Chang. I want to thank Bethany Lee. I want to thank Jessica Levin for being with us tonight, for their scholarship, for their dedication, for the work that you all are doing. I'm so excited to have a panel of West Coast folks so that I'm not being East Coast prejudice. And I really appreciate you all for being with us tonight. Thank you all who joined. I want to thank Jennifer Osias, who's our assistant, who has been helping us pull all of this together. And I want to thank the IT team at Howard University as well. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your night and look out for information on